So I'm going to handwrite that as well, so we're in the same place. Okay, so monohybrid crosses, what's that mean? Basically, yesterday we learned about genes, alleles, phenotypes, and genotypes, all that jazz. I'm just going to say we learned the foundation of genetics. You don't necessarily need to write this if you don't want to. I'm going to write it, but you don't need that. But today we're going to look at how this plays out. Okay, so let's say, for example, we're going to stick with our pea plants for the moment, which they're kind of boring. We'll get to more interesting stuff later, but the nice simple examples. And when we talk about, having the offspring breed with each other, we don't need to feel stressed or guilty about that, right? So that's good. So let's imagine that a plant with yellow peas is crossed with a heterozygous green-seeded plant. Oh boy, lots of language here. What will their offspring be like? So before we do any kind of math or anything, let's just ask, let's see if there's any language we're worried about. What does it mean crossed with? Yeah, bred. That's right, just procreated. Okay, so we know what that means. What do we mean by yellow seeds? Why didn't I bother saying whether this was homozygous or heterozygous? Well, let's recall that if the gene in question is for seed color, so the gene is for seed color, and the alleles are either big Y or little y. Does anyone remember what those code for? There should be a hint in the letters I've used. Yeah. Dominant and recessive, and the dominant one is the big Y or the little y? And what's that code for? Yeah, which, can I tell you something? It means I got these colors backwards. I'm so sorry. I'm so mad at myself right now. And it's right here on my note, too, and it's right on my note. I'm sorry. Can you go change it in the question? Guys, I'm sorry. You know what I feel right now? Ashamed. I feel a little bit ashamed. I hate that. I hate amateur. I will see. This will bug me like for the whole day. Things like this drive me crazy. I hate amateur hour. But here we are. Sometimes we all make mistakes. So, a plant with green seeds is crossed with a heterozygous yellow seed plant. Because what does the little y, the recessive trait, look like? Green. Could you have a heterozygous green plant? Well, I had to change this. I couldn't just say, well, we'll change it from my note. Is there such thing? See, what are the possible genotypes you could have? What are the possible combos? Because how many copies of a gene does every living thing always have? 2. There are exceptions again, by the way. There are some strawberries, I think, have something like 8 copies of every gene. kind of weird, but that's atypical. Most living things just have 2 copies, which means what combinations could you have? You could have big Y, or you could have big Y, little y, which is the same thing as little y, big Y, by the way. It doesn't make any difference. By convention, we put the uppercase letter first. Or you could be little y, little y. And what is the phenotype here? If you're big Y, what are you? Yellow. And if you're big Y, you're yellow. And if you're little y, you're green. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out the parents then. The first parent is a plant with green seeds. What must that plant's genotype be? From this possible list of genotypes, if it has green seeds, what's its genotype? It's got to be little y, little y. Does that make sense? So I'm going to call that plant mom, just, kind of help think that way. So we have the maternal genes. In other words, the genes that were in the seed there's a seed there, and it's got little y, little y. Okay. And then pollen comes around, and it's heterozygous for yellow seeds. What's that? Yep. Very good. Hetero means other or different. So its 2 genes are different, which means it's got the big Y, which codes for yellow, and it's got the little y that codes for green. But because it's got the big Y and because that's dominant, it's yellow. And it occurs to me using green as a color for that was stupid because, in fact, really what I ought to have done. I don't know if you guys... It hadn't occurred to me to make these yellows count, but really, we could do that, right? Wouldn't that be better? That'd be better, right? Pretty smart. I mean, if I'd done that in the first place, which I didn't. Okay, so we said the maternal seed is green. And then the paternal, what's maternal and paternal mean? Yeah, mother and father. And in this case, in plants, seeds are the female sex cell and pollen is the male sex cell. Now the pollen wouldn't actually be yellow, but that's okay. We're just gonna do that just for simplicity's sake. Big Y, little y, like that, right? So when these come together, what can happen? Well, they're gonna make the cells of a new plant, right? They come together to make an embryo, right? But when they come together to make an embryo, are all 4 copies going to end up in the new organism? No, it doesn't make sense, right? Like, your parents both have 2 copies of all their genes. If they gave you all their genes, you'd have 4 copies of every. And then if you, went and made babies with somebody else, would they have 8 and then 16? Do you see what I mean? Like, that doesn't work. So what's going to happen every time is we're not going to pass on both. We're going to pass on 1 each for a total of 2. Does that make sense? So what might that look like? Well, how many ways could they come together? Well, we could figure it out here, but what we're going to do is we're going to use a tool called a Punnett square. To see all the ways the 2 sex cells, in this case, the seed and the pollen, can come together to make an embryo, which is the offspring. So in other words, when mom makes the seed, what's actually happening, you don't have to draw this, but you could. What's actually happening is when she makes a seed, she's either going to make a seed that has the little y or a seed that has the little y. Does that make sense? Because it doesn't matter which one they get, right? But what about when this pollen actually gets made? What are the 2 possibilities? the big Y could get passed on or the little y, right? Even though the parent has green seeds, it can pass either one on, right? And then these can come together. So how do we draw that? A Punnett square is just what it sounds like. It's a square. And specifically, it's a square with 4 spaces inside. Boy, that is not very squarish. I can't handle that. Why wouldn't it default to being straight? This is a question. Even that's at a little bit of an angle, but I think I can live with that. So I want you to draw a square like this in your notes, and hopefully yours can look better than mine. That's super annoying. But basically, up here, we have the mother, or the maternal plant, I should say. In other words, the plant that provides the female sex cell. And the maternal genotype was little y, right? And then over here we have the paternal, and the paternal was big Y, little y, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so how could these end up? Well, the mother's either going to pass on this one, in which case we'd get a little y, or she's going to pass on this one, which happens in this case to also be a little y. Will those always be the same as each other? No, they are here because the maternal has 2 copies of the same. Does that make sense? Okay. What about down here, paternal? Well, he's either going to pass on the big Y, in which case we get a big Y here, or he's going to pass on little y, in which case we would get a little y here. Does that make sense? So this top row represents, I'm going to use new colors here. This top row represents possible maternal sex cells. In other words, a maternal sex cell, in this case a seed, is either going to have, is only ever going to have 1 copy of each gene, because you get 1 copy from your mom and you get the other copy from your dad. So these are the possible female sex cells. Let's go. That's a nice looking color. And what are these? Well, these are the possible male sex cells, which in a plant is pollen, right? And pollen fertilizes seeds. So there we go. So now, with that in mind, when they come together, if this piece of pollen fertilizes this possible seed, what do we end up with? We would end up with a big Y, little y. Does that make sense? Okay. What about if this one actually ends up with that seed? It's still going to be big Y, little y. What if, though, the father's little y ends up with the mother's little y? It would be little y, little y. And if the father's little y ends up with the mom's little y? Little y, little y. So here we have a combination where, remind me, what color was the mom here? Green. And what color was the father? Yellow, right? What color will this offspring here be? Yellow. What about this one down here? Green, yeah. What about this offspring? Green. And what about this offspring up here? Yellow. Now, does this mean that this plant can only have 4 offspring? No, of course not. Plants can have hundreds of offsprings. People tend to have 1 at a time, sometimes 2 at a time, sometimes 3, 4, 5, or 6 at a time, but typically people have 1 at a time. What about dogs? Say like 3 to 5? That's probably pretty typical for a litter. Anyone like a dog breeder? I've never had a dog have puppies. Sometimes as much as 8, eh? That's cool. And what about cats? Cats is like kind of single digits, but more than one as well, right? 2 or 3? Yeah. Fish, hundreds, right? Flies, tens of thousands, right? Depends on. But it doesn't matter how many you have at a time. The important thing is this isn't saying that there's 4 outcomes, but it means there's 4 possible combinations. In other words, out of every 4 of the offspring, one of them would be expected to be like this, one of them would be expected to be like that, one like this, one like that. Does that make sense? This is what we call a probability. It's telling us how likely each outcome is. Now, in this particular case, it happens that these 2 outcomes are the exact same as each other. Even though they happened a slightly different way, they end up being the exact same. And that'll happen sometimes. So in this case, now we can talk about 2 things. We can talk about the genotypic frequencies, which is a fancy way of saying frequencies, which sounds fancy, but really it just means how frequently do we see each genotype. And if we look up here, we said there's 3 possible genotypes, right? You could either be, so let's look at the P generation. And in the P generation, we don't care, sorry, P generation. What do we call this generation? They're kids? The F1 generation. In the F1 generation here, what are the only 2 genotypes we see? Big Y, little y. And how many of them are big Y, little y? Out of every 4, we would expect 2 of them. We could write that as a fraction. Nothing wrong with that. Could that be written as a better fraction? It's a better fraction version of that. A half is probably a little clearer. What if we wrote it as a percentage? What's a half as a percent? 50%. Cool. So in other words, if these 2 plants keep being crossed, we would expect 50% of their offspring to be big Y, little y. What's the other genotype here? Little y. And how often is that? 2 out of 4, which is 50%. Does that make sense? Is that okay? Does that feel cool? A little bit of math. Is that too much math or is that okay? Really? It's not bad, is it? Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't invent it. Talk to God or random chance or Gregor Mendel or something. Don't talk to me. I didn't make it. I just got taught it too. I had to learn it. What's the other type of frequency? We can talk about the genotypic frequency, which is how often we see each gene combination. We could also talk about does anyone remember the word? Phenotypic frequency. What's phenotype again? Genotype is what genes they have. Yeah, the trait, which in this case is what color they are. Very good. What are the 2 colors we have here? Yeah, green. And how many of them were green? 2 out of every 4, which is 50%. Very good. And the other color was yellow. And how many were yellow? Oh, sorry, I did cursive. Okay. How's that feel? Not too bad? Okay. We're going to do a little experiment in class right now. Not an experiment. We're going to do a little data collection. If I said, how was my lesson, and you all thought it was really good, one way you could show that is by giving me a big... Okay, so everyone, give me a thumbs up and make sure I can see your thumb from the side. Because what we want to look for is, see if you can spot it. Come on now. Yeah. There's kind of 2 distinct shapes when someone does this, which is, does the thumb kind of roll back or does it stay kind of straight? Yours, for example, pretty much stays straight, maybe a little bit at the top, whereas mine pretty evidently, you see that? Rolls back. This is actually a genetic trait. There's a gene we found that, let's see yours. Can you go sideways for me? A very large thumb, look at that. I'd say that's pretty straight. Does that make sense? Yeah. It does, but I'd say they're both still pretty straight, right? As opposed to like, see how mine like is at like a 45-degree angle? Like yours has a little curve, but like it's naturally pretty straight, right? Whereas like I don't have to work and mine is like at a 45-degree angle. Yours, 45-degree angle. 45, straight, right? Can you see the difference? Let's do a quick count here. Does anyone know what this trait is called? It's called the hitchhiker's thumb. Which like is silly because obviously anyone could hitchhike whether the thumb actually curled back or not. You know about hitchhiking? I've never been hitchhiking. I don't know if this is safe anymore. I used to hitchhike. You go out on the road and you just go like this at the side of the road and people stop and go like, you need a lift? Where are you going? You're like, I'm going to Toronto. And they go, okay, hop in. You hop in. They drive you to Toronto. They drop you off. This used to be a thing a lot more. It was already not much of a thing when I was a kid, but like my dad dropped out of high school and just like hitchhiked across Canada for 2 years. That was like a thing people would do. And you go to other countries and they still do it. We're a little bit more like, yeah, I always pick a hitchhiker up. You still see them once in a while. I mean, you say that. Here's my counterpoint to that. You have to have a lot of trust. What? Because the person might kill you? Okay. What about every other driver on the road as you're driving a bullet down a big steel cannonball down the road at 120 kilometers an hour, surrounded by morons who think that you can be like this close to the person in front of you and pass on the right. And I'm worried about the hitchhiker? Do you see what I'm saying? Really? We're worried about this guy sitting next to me? What's he going to do while I'm driving? Is he going to kill me while I'm driving? Wouldn't that kill both of us? I feel like I'm pretty safe from him. Now, I happen to know that who in here has the driver's license? And you want me to be worried about the hitchhiker? That's how you feel about that? Let me tell you who I'm worried about, crew. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I think we are bad at risk assessment. I would love to know how many people were killed by hitchhikers in the last, 50 years compared to how many people were killed by, like, I don't know, getting tangled in their bed sheets after a bad nightmare. And I bet it's a pretty similar number, but we still go to sleep at night. You know what I'm saying? That, right? That's maybe more of a thing. Yeah. But then, and then you think in the cell phone era, you could even be a little bit more safe, right? You just like snap a picture of that license plate before you get it and be like, just, I just texted my mom your license plate. Creepazoid, right? Like, I don't know. That's probably not a great thing to lead with before you're like, by the way, can you drive me somewhere for free? But the point is, hitchhiker's thumb. All right? Oh boy, here comes some art. Oh God. Does your thumb go like this? It's very good. It's very good art. Or, right.
The 6 fingers. I was gonna say.
No! I don't care. 6 fingers. This person has 6 fingers. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay.
Do you need somebody to draw it for you?
Quiet. Okay. So, as it turns out, this is a trait. Really quickly, let's just count. Somebody be in charge of counting. I'm bad at counting. Yeah, sure. Let's go around the room.
Why don't we all just raise our hands if our...
Okay. I'm going to take a look. And if you have a hitchhiker's thumb, raise your hitchhiker's thumb. Sorry? Show me yours. What? Freaking nature. I don't know what to tell you. Let's keep life easy and go with our right hands for now. That is really fascinating. Can I tell you something? I would still call it a hitchhiker's thumb, but I think, yeah. Look at yours, though. Like, that's a serious... Like, look at that. That's like almost like... That's probably 60 degrees. And you do not have a hitchhiker's thumb. Okay. Would you like me to... Whoa. Anyway, okay. Okay, so if you have a hitchhiker's thumb, hold it up. Somebody count for me. Let's see yours. Yeah, I'd say straight. All right. And, okay, fine. Raise your hand. Okay. And not. How many? Interesting. So about half and half. Now, does that give us a hint as to dominance? I actually like it turned out that way because one thing to know is dominant doesn't necessarily mean more common. As it turns out, one of these traits is dominant, one of them is recessive. You would expect there to be more people with the dominant trait if we start off with 50-50, right? Like that's how Mendel started off, right? With half dominant, half recessive, purebred bred them. But the recessive trait could have been around for a long time and the dominant trait only started showing up recently. Do you know what I mean? So you can't just look at the numbers. I like that these are equal. I'm not going to lie. I always forget which is which, and I look it up. So is hitchhiker's thumb dominant or recessive? I can check the note I have sitting right up there, but instead I'm just going to Google it. It's a recessive trait, as it turns out. So it turns out that this is a recessive trait. So this is a recessive gene. Meaning we have some gene with two alleles. And you either, I'm going to just go with T for thumb. Big T, what's the dominant trait? If recessive is hitchhiker's thumb, the dominant would be, do we want to say normal? Do we want to say straight? Do we want to say non-hitchhikers? What do we like? Straight? Okay. Non-hitchhikers seems like a lot of writing. And little t then would be what? I think there's a double H, which is a weird, that can't be right. Okay, now we gotta look it up. There is a second. Yeah, look at that, double H. That's the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. I mean, the answer is it's obviously a portmanteau. It's two words that have just been shoved together. But boy, that is awful. That could come up in Scrabble one day, and people would not trust you. They'd be like, I'm going to the dictionary. And then you'd be like, haha, joke's on you. It's in the Scrabble dictionary. But that's terrible. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Anyway, there we go. So now, first of all, if you have a hitchhiker's thumb, and again, I want to be clear, not all genetics are perfect, so for God's sakes, please don't show up tomorrow and be like, I'm adopted. But generally speaking, if you have a hitchhiker's thumb, if it's a recessive trait, what should be true about both your parents? They likely will also both have hitchhiker's thumbs. If one of, now, it doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be true. Because, of course, one of your parents could have one of each, right? Does that make sense? Sorry? That's possible. What would be more impossible is, what if both of your parents have hitchhiker's thumbs and you have a straight thumb? Then, again, you could just have a mutation, right? And that happens, right? Changes happen from generation to generation, but that might be a little evidence that you're adopted. But again, please don't come tomorrow and tell me you're adopted, because that's not meaningful evidence that you're adopted. By the way, you might be adopted, and that's wonderful. If you know that you're adopted, I think that's great. But just so you're aware, yes. Absolutely. Like, yeah, the pea plant we looked at was a perfect example, right? So yes, there's lots of possible combinations, and let's keep that in mind. So in this case, though, let's say then, that we have a mother. Let's give her a name. Let's go with Helga it is.
I don't know how to spell it, so.
Is crossed with, which when you start talking about people saying they're crossed with, sounds, it's a little bit euphemistic. It's sex, but anyway, is crossed with a father. Let's give him a name. Brian? What did you say? Barnes? What did you say? Brian Barnes. So Helga and Brian Barnes are crossed. All right, fair enough. You all right?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, this last one we're going to do together, and I'm going to leave you to get to work. But first things first, let's talk about Helga. We know that Helga is big T, which means that she has what trait? Sorry? Okay, so we would say she is homozygous, and specifically we'd say she is homozygous what? We'd say she's homozygous dominant. Okay, and what is her phenotype? In other words, what's her thumb look like? Straight thumb. Yeah. No problem. Zygous just refers to gene, and homo means same. So if you're homozygous, it means that your two copies of the gene are the same. If you're heterozygous, it means that your two copies of the gene are different from one another. And the fact that it's homozygous dominant means that they have two copies of the gene, and they are both dominant. If they're homozygous recessive, they'd have two copies of the gene that were both little t. And if they're heterozygous, it means one of theirs is beautiful. And in fact, how would we describe Brian? Heterozygous. We'd describe Brian as being heterozygous. Very good. I always think it's helpful to give people names. And tell me about Brian's thumb. This is a sentence you thought you'd never hear your teacher say. We would say Brian is heterozygous. And he has what? He's heterozygous. And we don't have to say heterozygous dominant or heterozygous recessive because by definition it's just one of each, right? All right, so what's Brian's thumb look like? Oh, I heard both answers. Obviously we'll handle that the only way. In this lesson, it seems like you two should have a thumb war. Do you think one person or another has an advantage in a thumb war? Like is hitchhiker thumb advantage? You get further back, right? Like you have more escape. All right, let's go. Come on. Let's go. 2, 3, 4. I declare a thumb war. Go. Oh, that was quick. That was quick. That was very fast. Anyway, as it happens, if you have one of each, which trait do you have? The recessive trait or the dominant? The dominant. And in this case, the dominant's what? Straight. So, this is exactly, actually, Severa, what you were asking about earlier. Mom and dad are both straight-thumbed here. But somewhere in one of their histories is a hitchhiker's thumb. Whose history for sure has a hitchhiker's thumb in it somewhere? Brian, right? Somewhere back there that gene exists, right? He's carrying it, but he's not expressing it because he's also got the dominant trait. What will the F1 generation be like? And we know F2 generation here, Brian and Helga, but F1 generation we'll go for. Okay, so we're going to make, what do we call this shape again? A Punnett square, good. And again, it's a 4x4 square. And the reason it's it's a 2x2 square, leaving us with 4 spaces. And the reason it's a 2x2 square is because they both have 2 copies of that allele, but when they go to make sex cells, they're not going to pass on both of theirs, right? So all of Helga's cells, the maternal cells, have, like we said, big T in it. What do we call human female sex cells? Egg, proverbially. What's its more technical name? Ovaries are where they're produced, and they are simply a single one is an ovum, and the plural are ova. Right? So an ovum, ova. The ovaries are where they're produced. When they are released by the ovaries into the fallopian tubes, we call that ovulation, right? So ovum means egg. And by the way, the reason we say egg is because ovum is literally just the Latin word for egg. Okay. So when the mum makes her possible sex cells, those will go here. There's 2 different ways mom can make a gamete here. A gamete is just another way of saying a sex cell. Yet another new word to learn, which in this case is an ovum, not an That V is important as it turns out. All right. She can either pass on this one, which will make an ovum that's carrying big T, or she can pass on this one, in which case she'll make an ovum that's carrying, big T. So in both cases, she's going to make the same because what is she? homozygous. So if both of her copies are the same, then both of her possible egg cells are going to be the same. Does that feel fair? All right. What about Brian? Brian wouldn't be referred to as maternal. He'd be referred to as paternal. And his genotype, the paternal genotype, is big T, little t. And when he goes to produce male sex cells, what do we call the possible male gametes? Spermatozoa. Yeah, sperm. Good. So possible gametes here, which in this case means sperm, right? Nope. Yeah, there's an R in there. Well, he'll either pass on this one, in which case he'll make a sperm cell that is big T, or he'll pass on this one, which will make a sperm cell that is little t. Does that make sense? And now, what are the possible combinations? Well, it's possible that this sperm cell could impregnate that egg cell, in which case we would end up with, very good, and by convention we always put the uppercase one first. What if this sperm cell impregnates that egg? Big T, little t. What if this sperm cell impregnates that egg cell? Big T, and this sperm and that egg? Big T. Good. So there we go. Those are our possible genotypes. So if we look at the genotypic frequencies, I'll write it out. Genotypes. In this case, we have big T at what percentage? 2 out of 4, which is 50%. Very good. And the other genotype we see is big T, little t at 2 out of 4, which is 50%. And what genotype do we not even see here, but is theoretically possible? Little t, and that is none of them, which is 0%. So the F1 genotypes in this case are 50% homozygous dominant and 50% heterozygous. This is an interesting case. When a homozygous dominant and a heterozygous parent cross, half their offspring have basically the same genotype as the mom, and half of them have the same genotype as the dad. That's not something you have to memorize. It just happens to be the case. That's just what we're noticing here. But does that make sense? Those are the genotypes. What's the other thing we can look at? Phenotypes. If genotype describes what genes they have, phenotype describes the traits. And what are the two traits here? Straight thumb and hitchhiker's thumb. Good. And what percentage of their offspring have straight thumbs? All of them, right? All 4. Which is 100%. And hitchhiker obviously then would be, which is 0%. That percent looks, I don't know what it looks like. It doesn't look like a percentage sign, that's for sure. There we go. How's that feel? Not too bad? Yeah.
So, like, since, like, the dominant gene, like, overpowers the fiddler one, and there's 0% of hitchhiker, does that mean, like, all the other offspring, like, all the kids, they just can't have...
That's right. So, again, does this mean they will have 4 kids? No. Could they have 1 kid? Sure. No. That 1 kid would have a 50% chance of being big T, have a 50% chance of being big T, little t, but no matter what, their kid is going to have a 100% chance of having straight thumb. Now, again, that's living in a world where mutations never happen. But remember, mutations do happen. So sometimes an offspring ends up with a different trait just because they've actually had, like, the genes have changed spontaneously. Mutations occurred. But mostly, this will end up being true. Yeah.
So then, like, the F1 generation, if they go on to have kids, like, does the hitchhiker gene just, like, die out? Like...
Well, no, not necessarily. So now, if it depends. So let's say this ends up being, I don't know, this is Gary. They have a kid. So Helga and Brian have a kid named Gary, right? That looks like it says gay, but his name isn't gay. His name is Gary. Nothing wrong with being called gay, but his name isn't gay. It's Gary. Gary isn't gay as it happens, and he has a husband named Roy, but they can't procreate themselves, so they get a surrogate, and her name is Lisa. And Lisa, so Gary ends up being big T, little t. and he marries what did we say his name was? Roy. Okay. And then they get a surrogate Lisa, and she's little t, and they have offspring. You could do a quick Punnett square, right? And you could see that Lisa could give us either a little t or she could give us a little t, and Gary could give us a big T or a little t. And now their offspring will either be big T, little t, or big T, little t, or little t, or little t, which means that 50% of the F2 generation, if this is the other parent, will have a hitchhiker's thumb. So this isn't even skipping a generation. This is from grandparents didn't have it. Parents, only one of them had it, right? And then they have it half the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So these things can go a lot of different ways. And that's why a Punnett square can be useful, because you can start putting different combinations together. You can also see how if you wanted to keep track of like 12 offspring, this could get really messy really quick, right? We use computers to simulate this if we're simulating big populations, but we can do it on paper for small populations. Yeah.
So, like, when it's big T and little t, like, they're not showing that thing. So is that how, like, when grandparents have, like, something, but then the actual kid doesn't have it, but then the grandkids, they have
Yeah. And these things happen. Traits show up that are unexpected, which is, again, why, like, if one of your kids ends up having, like, flaming red hair, despite the fact that you don't have flaming red hair, your partner doesn't have flaming red hair, and neither of your parents have flaming red hair, it doesn't mean you need to, like, seek divorce. It might just mean that, like, you had a recessive trait that was kind of hanging out in there, and it made its way to the surface by random chance. And again, also possibly mutation. Yeah, things, and there are some traits where even though the recessive trait is recessive, it's overwhelmingly more common, right? But there's some traits where the recessive trait is really, really rare. And so for it to come across, I had a student a few years ago, and she had a genetic disorder. You may know, do you know Jackson and Kayla Milewski? Lovely. She'd be comfortable with my talking about this. She actually did a presentation about her genetic disorder. But Kayla's a beautiful young lady, but she was about yay tall, just a little thing. And she had a condition where her hips were displaced, so she mostly was in a chair, but she could walk. But she had a rare genetic disorder, which actually required people who have the disorder are infertile, which means that for her to get this disease, her mom had to have this mutation in one of her egg cells, and that egg cell with that mutation had to happen to meet up with a sperm cell that had the same mutation because it's recessive and you have to have both copies of it. And that's why she was something like one of 300 people in the world with this condition, because it's just one of these things where it's like blindingly unlikely to happen. But there are 8.5 billion people on the planet, and that's a lot of eggs and that's a lot of sperm, and so there's just a possibility that that happens. So you can get some really interesting combinations. And keep in mind, we're only keeping track of one trait here. How many traits do you have? I mean, millions of traits, right? Like, you know, all sorts of traits that can be combined. So it gets really complicated. I have a little homework sheet for you. I have to go grab it off copier 1, unless some kind soul wants to sneak into copy. Did I do it copier 1 or copier 2? Let me quickly check which copier I sent it to. Because I was like, oh, I'm going to send it to copier blank, so I'll definitely have time to go get it. And then you know what I didn't do? I didn't go get it. Don't worry, I closed the document. I'm pretty confident it's on copier 1, but just to be on the safe side, does one person who feels brave and bold want to go to copier 1, which is in the main office down here? And does one other person want to go up to copier 2? And between the two of you, one of you will find my handouts. So if it's not there, just turn around. Thank you. God bless you. Yes? Yeah, you bet. Let's get going. Do you want to work in my office? Great. Did I do attendance? I don't know. Did I do attendance? It's a lot of tabs. I don't know what to do. Owl pellets are costing $19 per pellet this year. I don't know if I can afford to do that.